This is Groundeffected. My name is your dad, and today I'm gonna be painting a pawn. I mean, a poo spawn. A spawn poo. As well as a rabbit, which is actually Batman dressed as a rabbit. Or is it rabbit? It doesn't matter. Anyway, if we want to paint this model, the best thing to do is probably start out with a primer layer. That is going to be black, and considering it's quite a drabby looking model in terms of the color schemes that need to be part of this particular color scheme, I'm going to go with a bit more color than drab. And I'm going to paint that into the shadows and crevasses on this base. Now this may look like it's a little bit crazy, but it's not actually that crazy. This is going to be the setup for the undertones of which we are going to dry brush over the top of. And speaking of dry brush, now is a good time to bring out your wife's makeup brush, which is a very good dry brush. Of course, I didn't show you the color that I used, but that is because it doesn't really matter, as long as it's a gray of some kind. Now, gray is usually the color you make when you mix white with a bit of black. In case you don't have that in your actual color palette, you can just make it yourself. Now, the color that you can't really make is deck tan, and that is because this is such a pungent color. It is just so good at adding highlights when you want white in an area. And don't forget that white highlights are terrible, so don't do that for anything other than concrete or something that needs to be gray, in which case this thing. So, of course, deck tan as a highlight is a very good way of picking out the edges of the piece of base thing that I am painting. Now, of course, there is a little bit of some rooftop shingles on this little base, and I don't want them to be too bright, so I'm going to start out with a slightly reddish, dark reddish color, and I'm going to dry brush that first, then following up with a red leather color to dry brush over the top of that and catching some of the edges. And now around the rims of these little gargoyles, there is a thing that I probably should not have painted metal, but I painted it metal anyway. And metal, I mean actually just silver from Ammo by Mig. This is actually my favorite silver currently at the moment. I also took that exact same silver on a very small dry brush, which is also, by the way, a makeup brush that I bought for very cheap from the drugstore, and I dry brushed that over the little overhang things with the little skeletons on them. Now, of course, I used a little bit of liquid talent, which in my case is actually just this panel line wash from Tamiya, to make it look like I had some talent when I painted the metallic pieces. When I was done with my talent, I then glued those little gargoyles into the base. I also followed that up with that same dry brush and dragged some of that liquid talent down the sides of the model. And now to reinforce some of that color, I'm going to come back, because it is an old habit of mine and I just cannot help but do it. I'm going to add a little bit of a wash into the shadows on the base. This is a blue kind of wash, and this helps a lot. Now, Spawn Poo has this really huge cape, and it is very difficult to hold together in any other way other than just gluing it. So in my mind, the best way of doing this, particularly for getting in his base colors, was to just glue it. And also, speaking of base colors, I didn't want to ruin any of my base colors, so I wrapped that up in some cling film. This you can just buy from any food place, I think. A small word of caution when you are wrapping up with cling film: when you think you have got it fully wrapped, just wrap it one more time, because trust me, you don't want a nasty surprise when you get to the end. Now, taking this burnt cadmium red from Vallejo, I'm going to spray this literally directly over the top of everything as if it was the Zenithal. Like I said, the colors in this model need to be moody, they need to be dull, they need to be still colorful, but not quite so colorful. So in order to achieve that, I am not going to be putting a Zenithal over any of these models. I'm just going to be spraying them with the colors that they need in order to make that black underneath just stand out a little bit more. Now, to punch some of that red out, I'm going to spray a brighter ball red, which is a contrast red, over the top of the red that I had laid down previously. And in certain areas, I'm going to add some white ink, particularly the tips of his cape, the thing that's flowing up by the side of his neck. I don't know what that thing is called, the collar of his cape. It needs to be brighter, and so in order to do that, I painted some white ink over that and then sprayed the red over the top of that, because obviously with a whiter base, the red is going to look so much more like red, which is a good thing. Now I need to add some shadows into all the rest of those pieces that I've just added red to. And to do that, I'm going to use Caramel Crimson, which is a wash through my airbrush, and that's going to be what I called Bob, in fact, my uncle at that point. I can then now unmask or just take the cling film off of the base and put it back on my table. I don't know why that was very important, but I had to show that in this video. I'm going to take that same silver with absolutely no watering down and spray it directly through my airbrush. That silver from Emma by Meg is actually really amazing. Now to move on to the body parts, I sprayed a black over the top of his body, which is pretty much just black. There is nothing else to it other than the white little thing in the front, and I took that same black, which is a contrast paint, and I painted it over the rest of the parts of the body that needed black on. That was his hands, a little bit on his arm, as well as his feet and his head. And once I was done with his head, it was time to take that silver and paint it over all the spikes that are on his legs as well as his arms. Now this dude has a lot of spikes, and I will not bore you with watching a grown man paint a really lot of spikes on a Winnie the Pooh. But moving very swiftly on, I'm going to take some dry brushing techniques once again, and using grey, that's the same grey I used for the base by the way, and I'm going to dry brush over all the black parts that I painted earlier, because they are now dry enough for me to do this. And I want to be very careful not to overdo this, because if I do, I'm going to have a very sad time. Now taking some deck tan, I'm going to then paint that pretty much all over all the white markings that are on Spawn. I don't even know what to call this guy anymore, but those white markings need to be painted white. But in my case, it's actually deck tan, because white would just be way too bright and it would look absolutely ridiculous. Never ever paint directly with white, because that just looks dumb. Don't do that kind of a thing. Also, just to let you know, how I set up the white for the skulls was completely the reverse to this action, and I painted a brown over the top of the skeletons first. When I was done with that, I dry brushed deck tan over the top of them. It took about 3 layers because it was a very small place, and it was quite hard to do, but 3 layers was the trick, and it kind of worked out alright in the end. Now, I was not quite completely happy with it, so I took some skeleton horde and I sprayed that from the bottom areas as if it was a shadow on those skulls. I then set about gluing this magical chain that goes around the magical Pooh's waist, which I'm not gonna lie was a very fiddly event. But when I was done with that, I was able to stick him on his base. Yes, that's right, I had to stick him because he's very top heavy. Some particular models, it depends, but some models need to be glued in place because they just need to, and the magnets would not help you even if you had the biggest ones. In this case, these models needed to be stuck together, so I glued them all together. As you saw, I had glued Rabbit's legs together and gave him a primer layer, and while that sits aside drying, I'm going to paint the markings on Pooh's face. But this is also a very good time for me to tell you about the sponsor of this week's video, which is NiceX Collectibles. This is a veteran-owned Patreon, and they have some pretty fantastic deals. In the Print Vault, which is the tier 2, it's $15 a month, and as you consistently go through those months, you will be getting more and more and more models as time goes on. Now, of course, you are going to get a lot of these high-end quality models that you can 3D print and make your own pictures, kind of just like mine. This is the one that I'm doing this week. Of course, I would like for you to go and check them out in the description so that you can join NiceX Collectibles right now. Getting back to painting the rabbit, I am going to paint all of him with a grey, because pretty much Batman in this particular case is grey with a blue suit. Yes, it's black, but I'm actually going to make it quite blue, so I'm going to take some blue and just spray that over everything that I painted grey before. I'm also going to mask off certain areas on the body, because obviously I don't want to get any of this blue paint on any of the grey that I had left behind, otherwise that would make it look terrible. And the best way to mask this off is to give it a clear coat of glass. I don't know why, but this has helped me every single time I've done it. And while that clear coat is drying, I'm going to quickly spray a gnome oil wash into the shadows to reinforce some of the blackness of the blue that I'm actually doing. As you can tell, I've masked off using some masking tape. This is just simple masking tape, and I've just wrapped it around his legs to protect it. Now, of course, you do not want a shiny model because it looks terrible. So I spray some Liquitex matte clear coat over the top of everything everything once I've unmasked it and it's back to being a matte model, which is fantastic because now I can start using deck tan to line up the colors next, which are going to be yellow, and you cannot paint yellow over anything other than a light color. In this case, deck tan or a very bright pink, or light pink actually, would work very well to do that. And the yellow that I chose to use is Imperial Fist Yellow, which is a contrast paint, which is a terrible paint over anything other than a very light color, but it's a very nice yellow, and it does make things look yellow, which is a great thing. I then took some Iandan Yellow wash, and I sprayed that into the shadows of both his emblem in the middle of his chest, as well as his belt. I then very carefully took some black. My favorite black at the moment is Vallejo's matte black from the model color range and not the game color one, because they are not the same. Just trust me on this. They are not even alike. They're not even close to alike. They're not even the same freaking color. Never mind my rant. But once I was done with that lovely emblem in the center of his chest, I glued his hands on, and I also glued on his cape at this point, because there is not much else more I need to do with this guy other than to stick him on his base. And again, I glued this guy on because his cape would have pulled him backwards, and that's not a good thing. Now moving on to his face, I'm gonna paint some deck tan. There was a little bit of gray that's left over on his whiskers and his mouth and the beard, chin. Words are really hard at this point. After I was done with that, I just took that same deck tan and painted his eyes. I'm not even going to tell you the rest about his beard because I couldn't even say the word beard 2 minutes ago. Anyway, moving on from that, to paint Pooh's eyes, I used deck tan, but to be real, I painted them first using this Tesseract Glow. This was because I wanted to set up a darker green around the outside of the eyes, and then I painted deck tan in the center of the eyes and Tesseract Glow over the top of that, making them look like they're nice and glowy and bright and shiny. And when I was done with all of this, I pretty much decided to call this model done. We are at the end again of another Groundeffected video, and I want to say a super special thank you to the sponsor of this video. Please go and check him out in the description down below, and while you're there, maybe you want to check out my Patreon. If you want to support this channel, you can go and watch another video. That is the best way to support me. Share them with your gran, as well as check out my Patreon. If you want extra content, that is a thing you can check out. At this point, I also want to say a magical thank you to all of my patrons, because without them, I could not keep the lights blinding my eyeballs, and that is very important for making videos. This is also the part of the video where I tell you, if you were on the toilet, you should wash your bloody hands, and if you weren't, and you didn't like anything you saw, it doesn't matter. But you can kindly now f*** off. And pick the right colors, 'cause I'ma make a sick video, and then everyone will think